The day the letter arrived, I was standing at the small kitchen counter of my apartment in Chicago, staring at a chipped coffee mug half filled with cold brew I couldn't bring myself to drink. The envelope was thick, ivory paper, the kind only lawyers or banks seem to use, with my name typed in black ink. My name Sharon Carter. It looked so official, so distant, as if someone had plucked me out of my life and put me on trial. I slid it open with a dull knife and unfolded the pages. Dear Miss Carter, we regret to inform you of the passing of your father. According to his last will and testament, you are the beneficiary of his estate in Charleston, South Carolina. I read it 3 times, the words pressing deeper with each repetition. Father, beneficiary, estate. All of it felt alien, like it belonged to some other woman who had grown up in the embrace of a doting parent. Not me, not the girl who had spent winters in Detroit wrapped in a coat too thin for the snow, holding my mother's hand as she scrubbed other people's floors for $8 an hour. My father had never been a father. He had abandoned us before I could form a memory of him. My mother used to whisper his name Daniel like it was both a curse and a wound. He had walked out of our lives for another woman in Texas, starting a second family, showering them with the money he wouldn't spare us. I had once written him a letter when I was 9, begging for a single dollar so I could buy a used book at a school fair. No response ever came. Instead, I watched classmates clutch bags of new books while I stood empty-handed, a silence swelling inside me that hardened into resentment. And now, years later, he had left me something. A house in Charleston. An estate, the lawyer said, with grounds, accounts, and family property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He hadn't written me letters, hadn't sent a dime to keep the heat on during brutal Michigan winters, but in death he had chosen to throw me the scraps of his legacy. I should have felt relief, maybe even gratitude, but all I felt was fury. The letter in my hand might as well have been drenched in gasoline, and I was ready to strike the match. I crumpled the pages and slammed them down on the counter. The thought of him lying in some coffin at peace sickened me. He deserved no peace. He deserved to feel what we had felt, the hunger, the cold, the humiliation of being left behind like unwanted trash. But he had escaped judgment, tucked 6 feet under the soil while his blood still ran through my veins. My rage had nowhere to go, so I let it settle into a vow. If he had left me his estate, then I would claim it. But I wouldn't claim it with gratitude. I would claim it like a conqueror seizing the spoils of war. His gift wasn't reconciliation, it was provocation. And I was ready to answer it with fire. I didn't call the lawyer right away. I poured myself the coffee I hadn't wanted, took a long bitter sip, and looked out the window at the cold Chicago skyline. The city had taught me how to survive on my own terms. I had clawed my way through college with scholarships, temp jobs, and nights spent eating cheap noodles when rent swallowed my paycheck. Every struggle had carved me sharper, harder. Now, with this inheritance dangling before me, I saw not a gift but a weapon. I wanted to see what kind of world he had built for himself in Charleston. I wanted to walk through the halls he had chosen to fill with his absence. And most of all, I wanted to desecrate the sanctuary he thought he was leaving behind. 2 days later, I called the lawyer back. His voice was smooth, professional, distant. He told me the property was in my name now, that the estate was fully mine to claim. He asked if I wanted to fly down for the reading of the will. I said yes, but my yes carried a venom he couldn't hear. On the flight to South Carolina, I thought about my mother. She had died before she could ever see a cent of restitution from the man who abandoned her. I carried her photo in my wallet, folded at the corners, her eyes tired but kind. I whispered to it as the plane cut through the clouds. Don't worry, Mom. He'll pay. He'll pay through me. When I arrived in Charleston, the air was warm and heavy, thick with the smell of salt and magnolia. A car service sent by the lawyer took me through wide streets lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Then we turned into a gated drive, and there it was, my father's house. White columns rose from a brick porch, the kind of southern estate you see in glossy magazines or old family portraits. The windows were tall, the doors wide, the grounds stretching into manicured lawns that seemed to whisper of old money and European roots. I hated it on sight. The lawyer greeted me at the door, a balding man in a navy suit who looked as though he'd lived his whole life reading documents in dim offices. He handed me keys, papers, and a folder listing the accounts left to me, $350,000 in cash, bonds worth more, and the deed to this sprawling house. He spoke of legacy, of family history, of roots that stretched back to Europe. I let him speak, but my mind was elsewhere. Legacy? History? Roots? These weren't my legacy. They were my history. My roots had been planted in Detroit concrete, watered with my mother's sweat and my own bitterness. This house wasn't a gift. It was an apology dressed as a prize, an apology too late to matter. When the lawyer left, I wandered through the house. The air inside smelled of cedar and dust. Portraits of stern-faced men hung on the walls, their eyes painted to follow me as if I were trespassing in their kingdom. My father's study still bore the faint trace of his cologne, a musky, arrogant scent that clung to the leather chairs and oak desk. I opened drawers, cabinets, boxes, searching for something, maybe a letter, maybe a confession, maybe some proof that he had thought of me at all. What I found were letters my mother had written. Dozens of them tied with string, begging for help. Pleading for even $50 to keep the heat on, to buy food, to take care of the daughter he had left behind. Every word bled desperation. And every one of them had been shoved into a drawer, unopened, unanswered. I sank into his leather chair, clutching those letters, my nails digging so deep into my palm that blood dotted the paper. This wasn't just neglect, it was cruelty, it was mockery. He hadn't ignored us out of forgetfulness, he had chosen to look away, to dismiss us as less than nothing. My body shook with rage. The inheritance in my name, the house, the money, it wasn't restitution. It was salt on the wound. At that moment, I made a silent vow. I would not simply take what he left. I would burn his legacy down to ashes. I would strip away every illusion of greatness his name carried. I would turn his gift into a weapon, and I would wield it with aggression sharp enough to cut through generations. This was no inheritance. This was the beginning of my revenge. When I first stood before the estate in Charleston, I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me. White columns rose high against the Carolina sky, gleaming in the late afternoon sun like ivory teeth. The house stretched wide, proud and unyielding, as if daring me to step inside and measure myself against the ghosts of its past. To anyone else, it might have seemed majestic, a crown jewel of Southern history. But to me, it was a monument to arrogance, the fortress of a man who had denied me warmth, love, and dignity. The gates groaned open as I walked through, dragging my suitcase behind me. The driveway was long, lined with oaks draped in Spanish moss that swayed like tattered banners of forgotten wars. I paused for a moment, staring at the porch where brass lanterns hung from hooks, polished and gleaming as though the house itself expected someone better than me to arrive. The bitter thought tasted sharp on my tongue. He wanted to keep me out. Even in death, he thought I'd never walk these steps. Inside, the air was heavy, stale with dust and cedar. My footsteps echoed across the marble floor as I wandered through the grand hall. Paintings of men in tailored suits, women in pearls, and children with stiff collars lined the walls. Each portrait seemed to watch me, their eyes cold, accusing, as though I were an intruder trespassing in their legacy. They were his people, his world, his chosen family. And they had never once acknowledged that I existed. I opened the doors to room after room, parlors furnished with velvet chairs, a dining room dominated by a table long enough to seat 20, a kitchen with copper pots still gleaming on the wall, all of it immaculate, curated and cold. It was a house built for appearances, not for living. A house of facades, much like the man who owned it. The lawyer had told me the estate came with more than walls and columns. There was money, $350,000 in cash, bonds, and property investments. To most, it would be a fortune, a new start, a blessing. To me, it was blood money. I thought of the nights I'd worked 2 jobs in Chicago, pulling shifts at a bar after studying all day, walking home with blistered feet and barely $20 in tips. I thought of the winters in Detroit when my mother and I had huddled together beneath blankets, praying the power wouldn't shut off again. And now, suddenly, I was supposed to feel grateful for this inheritance. No, this wasn't a gift. It was an insult wrapped in wealth. Upstairs, in what must have been his study, I found the truth that set my blood boiling. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and arrogance, leather-bound books lining every wall. On the desk, beneath a stack of unopened bills, I found a drawer that stuck slightly when I pulled it. Inside were letters tied with a string. My breath caught as I recognized the handwriting, my mother's. I sat in his chair, the leather creaking beneath me, and untied the string. The letters spilled across the desk, each one a plea. "Daniel, please, Sharon needs new shoes for school. We can't keep the heat on without help. I beg you, just $50, she's your daughter too." Dozens of them. Desperate, aching, filled with words my mother had swallowed with tears so I wouldn't see. And every single one had gone unanswered. He had read them, or maybe not, and shoved them in this drawer like trash, never sending a dime, never sparing a thought for the daughter he abandoned. I pressed the papers so hard in my fists that my nails cut my palms, blood smearing the ink. I could almost hear my mother's voice, her shame when she confessed that no help was coming, her trembling as she tried to reassure me that we'd be fine. My throat burned with rage. This was who he had been, not a man, but a coward who chose indifference over responsibility. The inheritance wasn't a reconciliation, it was mockery. A final sneer from the grave. And in that moment, sitting in his chair with his ghost staring down at me from gilded frames, I knew exactly what I would do. I wouldn't preserve this house. I wouldn't honor his name. I would take everything he left me and turn it into ruin. I would spit on his legacy and carve my own in its place. I wandered deeper into the house, each step fueled by anger. In his bedroom, the bed was perfectly made, the sheets stiff and untouched, as if even death had refused to muss them. On the dresser, I found cufflinks of gold, engraved with initials that weren't mine. He had prepared for eternity, but eternity had chosen me to carry his name forward. The irony twisted inside me like a knife. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the study with those letters spread out in front of me, the desk lamp casting a pool of yellow light over my mother's words. I drank from the bottle of whiskey I found in the cabinet, each swallow burning like gasoline, and I planned. Revenge wasn't just an impulse, it was strategy. I would sell the house, drain its value, and strip every ounce of dignity from it. I would dig into his accounts, take every dollar, and wield it as my own weapon. And when I was done, there would be nothing left of Daniel Carter's grand empire except for the daughter he had tried to erase. Standing at the center of the ashes, I rose from the chair, grabbed one of the portraits from the wall, and hurled it to the floor. The glass shattered, shards scattering across the polished wood. I stared at the painted face of some ancestor, his ancestor, not mine, and I felt the rage pulse in my veins like a second heartbeat. "Your line ends with me," I whispered, though I wasn't speaking to the painting. I was speaking to him, to all of them, to the name they had tried to carry into eternity. I would make sure it ended. I looked around the study one last time before heading to bed in one of the empty guest rooms. The house creaked in the night, the old timbers groaning like it resented my presence. I welcomed the sound, let it hate me, let it resist. This house would be mine, and I would gut it from the inside out. As I lay staring at the ceiling, I thought of my half-brother Michael in Dallas, the golden son who had inherited the rest of my father's wealth. He lived untouched, unscarred, basking in the life I had been denied. The thought of him made my teeth clench. My father might be dead, but Michael was alive, and through him, I could finish what death had denied me. My revenge wouldn't end with this house. It would bleed into every corner of the Carter name, until nothing remained but the story I told, the story of a man who abandoned his daughter and paid the ultimate price. And I would be the one to collect. I sold the Charleston estate within a month. The buyers were a young couple from New York, with dreamy eyes and the kind of money that makes them imagine restoration instead of rot. They paid me $420,000 for the house, and I signed the papers without so much as a backward glance. Watching them walk across the lawn, whispering to each other about their plans, I felt no attachment, no nostalgia. The place had never been mine. It had been a mausoleum to my father's cruelty, and now it was just cash in my account. But money alone wasn't enough. Money could pay bills, buy comfort, maybe even a slice of respectability, but it didn't erase the years of hunger and humiliation. It didn't soothe the bitter nights when I heard my mother cry quietly into her pillow, thinking I was asleep. No, money was just a tool, and I needed more than tools. I needed destruction. That was when I learned of him, Michael Carter, my half-brother, my father's golden son. The lawyer mentioned his name casually, almost in passing, like a footnote. Michael had inherited the lion's share: stocks, bonds, a sprawling vacation home in Florida, and more millions than he'd ever need. The bulk of the Carter fortune had passed smoothly into his hands, as though the universe itself had conspired to reward him for simply existing. It lit a fire in me so fierce I thought my veins would burst. Michael had grown fat on everything I had been denied. While my mother and I scraped by in Detroit winters, Michael had lived in Dallas with warm meals, designer clothes, private schools, and a father's hand resting on his shoulder. I had grown strong from deprivation, but he had grown entitled from indulgence. And now he was the living reminder of every cruelty my father had committed against me. I packed a suitcase and flew to Dallas. The city was a sprawl of glass towers and endless highways, humming with oil money and banking power. I booked a modest room in a downtown hotel, nothing extravagant, just enough to keep me close to him. From there I began to watch. Michael Carter wasn't hard to find. He lived like the kind of man who never imagined the shadows might be watching. Every morning he drove his sleek black BMW from his gated home in Highland, parked to a bank tower where he worked as an investment director. Every evening he slipped into bars, country clubs, and steakhouses, laughing too loudly, shaking hands too firmly, surrounding himself with men who worshipped money and women who clung to it. The first time I saw him, I felt bile rise in my throat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with our father's jawline and eyes the same sharp blue as mine. The resemblance felt like an insult. He carried himself like a man untouchable, immune to consequence, certain of his place in the world. My blood boiled. I knew then that I wouldn't just take from him, I would dismantle him. The introduction had to be calculated. I approached him at a charity gala, dressed in a simple black dress that gave me the air of mystery I wanted. He noticed me immediately. Men like Michael always did. I let him come to me, a drink in his hand, a smile too polished on his face. "You're new here," he said, his voice smooth, trained for boardrooms. I tilted my head, feigning shyness. "Not exactly, my name's Sharon Carter." His smile faltered just slightly, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Carter, that's my name." I let the silence stretch just long enough before saying softly, "I know." The hook was set. I played my role perfectly, the lost sister, the daughter from his father's first marriage, the secret he had never known. I wove my story carefully, mixing truth with omission, letting him believe I had come not with rage but with longing. He welcomed me with surprising ease, perhaps too eager to embrace the drama of discovering family. Or perhaps he just liked the novelty of having a sister who looked like him but spoke with fire in her voice. Weeks passed, and I slid into his circle. He introduced me to his friends, showed me his world of fine dining and private clubs. I smiled, laughed, and listened, always watching, always calculating. Beneath the polished surface, Michael was rotten. I learned his weaknesses quickly: gambling. He played poker at underground tables, losing more money in a night than my mother and I had lived on in a year. He had affairs with women younger than him, slipping them jewelry and promises he would never keep. He had debts, real debts, to men who didn't take broken promises lightly. The arrogance that shielded him in public was the same arrogance that left him blind to me. He thought I was harmless. He thought I was family. He didn't realize that family, in my world, wasn't a bond, it was a weapon. One night, over whiskey at a dim-lit bar, he confessed more than he should have. "You know, Sharon, I've got it all, the bank job, the house, the money. But sometimes I gamble too much, drink too much, take too many risks. I always land on my feet, though. Always have." I smiled into my glass, my teeth clenched tight. "Not this time, brother." I began to plant seeds. Small whispers placed carefully, a suggestion here, a hint there. To one of his rivals at the bank, I hinted at discrepancies in accounts. To a woman he slept with, I whispered that he was talking about her to others. To a man he owed money, I let slip that Michael had more assets than he admitted. I didn't need to invent much, the truth was damning enough. I just nudged it into the right ears. It was intoxicating, watching the cracks form. His laughter grew forced, his shoulders tighter. He started checking his phone more often, looking over his shoulder when he thought no one noticed. The shield of arrogance was beginning to splinter, and I wanted to drive the knife deeper. Each night I returned to my hotel room and thought of my mother, of those letters she had written to a man who never answered. I remembered her tears, her exhaustion, her quiet resilience. And I vowed that Michael would feel all of it. Not because he had written those letters, but because he had reaped the rewards of them being ignored. I wasn't here for family. I wasn't here for closure. I was here for justice, my own brand of it. And justice in my hands wasn't blind. It was vicious, deliberate, and hungry. Michael Carter thought his life was untouchable, that his fortune and charm made him invincible. He had no idea that his ruin was already in motion. And I would be the one to watch him fall, piece by piece, until he stood in the same place my mother and I had once stood, broken, desperate, begging for help that would never come. It didn't take long for the whispers to grow teeth. I had fed them carefully, one by one, to the men who hungered for opportunity and weakness. In Houston, I found the kind of men Michael Carter had promised money to and never fully paid. They were waiting for an excuse to pounce. I gave them one. In Dallas, I nudged rivals at his bank with hints of missing figures and hidden accounts. The seeds I planted bloomed into poison before he even realized the soil had turned. At first, he brushed it off. Michael was used to winning, used to stepping over cracks without ever falling through. He walked into the bank with his polished grin and crisp suit, shaking hands like he owned the air around him. But arrogance is a fragile armor. All it takes is one hit in the right place to make it shatter. That hit came when the board called him into a private meeting. They asked questions about client accounts, about figures that didn't align, about numbers that suggested more than recklessness, something criminal. Michael stammered. I knew because I had contacts who told me how pale he turned in that room. His charm had no value in the face of cold numbers. The investigation began. And while the walls of his career closed in, I pressed harder. His gambling debts resurfaced with a vengeance. Men he owed tens of thousands to started knocking on doors, not asking politely this time but demanding, threatening. I made sure they had all the details they needed. Where he drank, where he parked, even which women he entertained behind his wife's back. Fear followed him like a shadow. His wife, a woman named Claire with the patience of a saint and the beauty of someone who had never known hunger, finally snapped. She left him after a scene so public it made whispers spread through every corner of his world. She took their children, their home in Highland Park, and a slice of his dignity with her. By then, his accounts were frozen, pending the investigation. The millions he had inherited were suddenly beyond his reach, like fruit on a tree he could no longer climb. He tried calling friends, begging for loans. He asked for 5,000 here, 10,000 there. At first, they gave it, believing the downfall was temporary. But when I spread word of the board's suspicions, of the debts that grew claws, those friends began to vanish too. By the end, he was begging for $500 and being met with silence. I watched it all unfold, not from the shadows this time, but from a seat so close I could taste the collapse. One night, I found him at a bar, slouched over a glass of cheap bourbon, his suit wrinkled, his tie gone, his hair a mess. The man who once strutted like a king now looked like a peasant waiting for scraps. I slid onto the stool beside him, and when he turned, his eyes widened with recognition. Sharon, he muttered, voice hoarse. You don't know what's happening to me. I tilted my head, feigning concern. I've heard.
He laughed bitterly, a sound like glass breaking.
They're after me, the bank, the investors, the men I borrowed from. He rubbed his face, trembling. I don't know how it all went wrong so fast. I leaned closer, letting my words cut like a blade. It went wrong the moment you thought you were untouchable. The moment you believed you could live on the ruins my father left behind without consequence. He blinked, confused. What do you mean? I smiled, sharp and merciless. I mean, you were never meant to win. You've been eating from a table built on my mother's hunger. You've lived off the comfort that was denied me, and now it's time to pay. His jaw slackened, realization dawning too late. You did this. I finished what our father started, I said coldly. He abandoned me, he left me nothing but rage. And I've used it to burn down everything he gave you. For a moment he looked like he might fight back, argue, deny it. But then he sagged, defeated, his hands trembling as they clutched the glass. His empire was gone, his pride broken, his world in ashes. He couldn't even summon the arrogance to stand tall anymore. I left him there, drowning in bourbon and self-pity, knowing he would never rise again. Within weeks, the bank fired him. Investigators tore apart his records, and though they never proved embezzlement, the stain was enough to blacklist him from every financial institution worth working for. His debts mounted until the BMW was repossessed, the country club revoked his membership, and the vacation home in Florida was seized to pay off creditors. I, meanwhile, walked away untouched. I had already sold the Charleston house, taken the $420,000, and invested it smartly. Between that, the cash from my father's accounts, and the moves I made while watching Michael fall, I now had $770,000 sitting clean in my name. No questions asked, no strings attached. But the money wasn't the true prize. The real prize was the look on Michael's face that night at the bar, when the realization dawned that his sister, his forgotten, abandoned sister, had orchestrated his ruin. That look was worth more than any inheritance, more than any mansion or stock portfolio. Some people call it revenge. They say it like it's poison, like it's ugly, but I know the truth. Revenge is balance. Revenge is justice carved by the hand of the wronged. When the dust settled, I moved to New York City. I bought a high-rise apartment with glass walls that overlooked the skyline, the kind of place my mother and I would have marveled at from the street below. I stood on the balcony one night, the city lights glowing beneath me like fire, and I felt the weight of it all. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the night, and whispered to the wind. Father, you left me nothing but rage, and I used it well. I thought of my mother, of her letters crumpled in that drawer, of her tired eyes and strong hands. I wish she could see me now, not because I was rich, but because I had taken back the power stolen from us. Michael Carter was finished. Daniel Carter's legacy was ashes. And I was the last one standing? The Carters would be remembered, but not for their wealth, not for their estates or their power. They would be remembered because of me, because I took what was denied, because I turned their arrogance into rubble, because I carved my revenge into the very bones of their name. I smiled into the night, the city's heartbeat pulsing beneath me, and I knew this was only the beginning.